Ambassador Elia's work arrived at Conquered Spindle during one of Administrator Violin Soar's worst shifts in months. Violin had been awake for 19 standard hours handling a food panic, a translation dispute, and an emergency complaint claiming the visiting Cellaran choir qualified as an acoustic weapon. So when the new human delegation requested a live reception instead of automated intake, Valen was already prepared to dislike them. Conquered Spindle hung above a pale gas giant like a silver ring. All polished walls, gravity layers, and neutral architecture. Valen floated down from the administrative gantry just as the shuttle doors opened and saw the lead human step onto the dock with a calmness that felt almost provocative. Elia's work was tall for a human, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed in a formal Earth suit that looked expensive and utterly unfit for survival. Behind him came 2 security officers and a junior aide carrying cases. Violin extended a lower limb in greeting. Ambassador Rourke, welcome to Conquered Spindle. I am Administrator Vale and Sorora. I trust your journey was acceptable. Elia smiled, that deeply confusing human expression that exposed teeth without necessarily signaling threat. Smooth ride, he said, taking the offered limb with careful warmth. Appreciate the welcome. Valen withdrew before the human heat became distracting. Your quarters are prepared. The reception assembly begins in 90 minutes. I advise rest until then. You say that like rest is realistic on a station this interesting, Ellis replied. Valen was about to explain that interesting usually meant exhausting when he heard a fast, clicking scrape from the cross corridor and felt every sensory frill tight. The cub was loose again. Handler Jess appeared a second later, out of breath and clearly losing a fight with the guide tether in his hands. At the other end loped a young Varric cub named Keth, midnight-scaled and already big enough to terrify most adult visitors. Varrics were one of the Council's most dangerous allied species, pursuit predators, whose young were usually kept planet-side until they learned that curiosity and teeth should not operate at the same speed. Keith was on Conquered Spindle because his mother insisted he needed off-world socialization if peace with other species was ever going to mean anything. Violin privately called that policy administrative sabotage, the cub's silver eyes fixed immediately on the new arrivals. Administrator, Jess said, breath-catching. My apologies. The exercise gate failed. Yes, I gathered, Vale said. Ambassador, do not move. Kay is trained, but he is still young. Alas looked directly at the cub with open interest instead of sane caution. That's the Varric juvenile from the brief. Valen stared. Yes, he's beautiful. Jess flinched. Ambassador, respectfully, do not advance. Ellis lifted both hands. Wasn't planning to. Keith came closer anyway, tail low, nostrils working through the human scent. The cub circled once, claws ticking softly on the dock plating. Valen watched the posture change and disliked it at once. Curiosity was tipping into overload. Jess, Valen snapped. Pull him back. Jess reached for the tether. Wrong moment. The sudden movement crossed Keth's vision just as Elas shifted one hand, probably to seem less threatening, and instinct won the race. The cub lunged. Keth slammed into Elas and clamped his jaws around the human's left forearm. Blood spotted the gray sleeve almost immediately. Jess shouted. Velan's mind leapt straight to evacuation routes and emergency notices. This was how species incidents started. Then Elas hissed through his teeth and said in the calmest voice on the dock, Hey, easy little man, that arm is in use. Keith released him instantly. The cub stumbled back, scales bleaching pale with shock. Valen shot forward. Medical team Dock 9 now. Venom protocol. Then to Elia's do not move. Varric saliva carries enzymatic agents. You may experience clotting failure, muscle collapse, or systemic shock. Elas looked down at his arm. Seems rude, Ambassador. This is not the time for humor. It is exactly when my people use humor. Then, to Valen's horror, he knelt. Keith had backed himself against the bulkhead and was making a small broken sound deep in his throat. He did not look dangerous now. He looked young. Hey, Elia said softly. Look at me, Keth did. His eyes were huge. His body had tucked inward despite his size. I bit you. The cub whispered through his translator tag. I bit a guest. Mother will be ashamed. They will send me away. Elas let out a slow breath, pain tightening his mouth. but not his voice. You got scared and made a bad choice. That's not the same as being bad. Valen could only stare. Keth's scales flickered weakly. I hurt you a little, Ellis admitted, but I've had worse from a kitchen knife and one truly evil farm animal. One of the human guards made a strangled noise that sounded like laughter. Ellis shifted his bleeding arm, ignored Valen's protest, and rested his hand gently on the cub's head ridge. You apologize, you learn, you do better next time. That's how this works. Keith lowered himself to the floor, miserable. I am sorry, human. Elias smiled softer now. Accepted, kid. When the medical team finally burst onto the dock, they found an impossible scene. A bleeding human diplomat, a crying predator cub, and Administrator Valen, realizing with growing dread that this was not a disaster ending. It was the beginning of something far stranger. By the time Dr. Issa of Vaughn finished examining Elia's work, half of Concord Spindle had already heard that a predator cub had bitten the new human ambassador. In some retellings, the human nearly lost his arm. In others, he had somehow subdued the animal with a look. The truth was stranger and to Administrator Vale and Soar far more disturbing. Ellis sat on the medical platform with his sleeve cut away and his forearm wrapped in a clear sealing mesh, while Vaughn scanned the punctures with mounting irritation. This should be worse, she muttered. Verac jaw pressure normally crushes bone. Their saliva carries enzyme chains that should begin tissue collapse. Yet your bleeding has already slowed, and the surrounding muscle is stabilizing. Elias looked at his arm and then at her. So, the official diagnosis is that I'm annoyingly alive. The official diagnosis, Vaughn snapped, is that your species violates good medical judgment. Valen hovered near the doorway, still running through diplomatic contingency plans. Ambassador, the LEA on board has requested a formal statement. They can have one in a minute, Elias said. I'm busy offending your doctor by healing. Before Valen could answer, a soft scrape came from the corridor. Keith stood in the doorway, scales faded pale with shame. Handler Jessica Hopeless stepped behind him. The cub approached with painful care and placed a folded square of cloth on the floor. It was the handkerchief Elis had dropped on Dock 9, washed and dried, if not neatly folded. I brought back your blood cloth, Keth said in a small, strained voice, and I am sorry again. I know I already said it, but the bite made the first apology seem weak. Ellis went very still, then his face softened. That was kind of you, buddy. Keith lowered himself to the floor. Are you angry? No, Elias said. Sore? Yes. Angry? No. Vaughn clicked in disgust. You should be angry. It would simplify things. Ellis ignored her, reached out with his uninjured hand, and rested it gently between Keth's head ridges. The cub shivered. You got scared, Elias said. You made a bad call, then you knew it was a bad call and came back anyway. That matters. Keith's scales flickered uncertain blue. My mother says apologies only count if you change after them. Elias smiled. Your mother sounds smart. Valen watched in disbelief. There was no performance in the human. He was comforting the creature that had attacked him because the creature was upset. Yet Keth's breathing slowed under his hand, and the panic drained out of him a little at a time. The evening reception became less a diplomatic event and more a public experiment in whether reality still meant anything. Delegates clustered beneath the neutral lights, pretending not to stare, while Elas moved through introductions with his bandaged arm, and Keith shadowed him at a guilty distance. Counselor Thress drifted close and whispered, "Should the cub not be restrained?" Valen looked across the hall. Keith had stopped at the edge of the human circle, clearly wanting to approach and equally clearly afraid he had lost that right. I am beginning to suspect restraint is not the variable that matters here, Valen said. A moment later, Elas noticed the cub lingering and crouched despite the pull in his injured arm. You can come over, he said. Keth crept closer on silent claws. Dr. Vaughn said, You hurt because of me. She isn't wrong. Then why are you still nice? That silenced the nearest tables. Elas considered the question only briefly. Because pain doesn't always mean cruelty, he said. Sometimes it means somebody got scared before they knew what else to do. Keith studied him. That is not how adults usually talk. Humans are weird adults, Ellis replied. We've got a lot of practice with young things that have teeth. He picked up a small magnetic serving sphere and rolled it gently across the polished floor. "Go get that for me." Keith bounded after it, caught it, and returned with obvious pride. Olas took it, nodded solemnly, and rolled it again. By the third return, even Jess looked emotionally compromised. "Administrator," Thress whispered, "is the ambassador training the hazard species?" Villain watched Ella scratch lightly behind Keth's head ridge, while the cub rumbled with pleased embarrassment. "I believe," he said slowly, "the ambassador would say they are becoming friends." Later that night, Valen found Elas alone in the garden dome with Keth asleep against his leg. "You should be resting," Valen said. Elas glanced down at the sleeping cub. He didn't want to be by himself. Valen let that answer settle. Most envoys would have demanded punishment. Elas looked out at the stars. Most envoys didn't grow up around scared animals and scared kids. Fear makes people do stupid things. The part that matters is what they do after. Valen studied the bandaged arm resting near Keth's scaled shoulder. "You do not think him harmless?" "No," Elas said. "I think he's young. There's a difference." That line followed Valen back to his office. He opened a new report and began typing more slowly than usual. Human risk protocols would need revision. Hazard interaction standards would need revision. Possibly the Council's entire understanding of predators would need revision if one human bitten and bleeding could answer instinctive violence with patience and get remorse in return. Valen paused before adding a private note at the bottom of the file. Humans may not be dangerous because they ignore fear. They may be dangerous because they look directly at it, decide it is not the whole truth, and make room for friendship. Anyway, 3 days after the bite, Conquered Spindle convened an emergency review, and Administrator Vale and Sword discovered that there were few things in the galaxy more exhausting than officials trying to classify a human reaction as if it were a chemical spill. The chamber was all polished metal, floating witness platforms, and nervous diplomacy. Representatives from a dozen member species attended because any incident involving a human ambassador and a Verarak cub was certain to become policy by morning. Elias Rook sat in the center, with his injured arm in a sling he clearly disliked. Kay sat beside his chair on the floor, claws tucked in, tail wrapped tight. Handler Jess stood 2 paces behind, ready if needed, but the cub had not left Elia's side in days, except when forced to sleep. "This session is convened to assess diplomatic risk and behavioral precedent," announced Councillor Menvar. "Ambassador Rourke, do you confirm that the juvenile Varric caused your injury without deliberate provocation?" Elas nodded once. "Yes. And yet you have declined grievance, security separation, and hazard compensation." "Also yes." Murmurs rolled through the chamber. Menvar narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Elas looked down at Keth and answered simply because he got startled, made a bad choice, and knew it the second he did it. Keith lowered his head. "I did know," he whispered, and the translators carried it farther than he intended. "I was ashamed before the human even bled." He did not sound like a weapon cornered into manners. He sounded like a child, terrified that one mistake had made him unforgivable. Dr. Isa Vaughn delivered the medical report with open annoyance. The ambassador's bones remained intact, despite a bite force that should have shattered them. Toxin response was present, but limited. Human clotting speed prevented catastrophic blood loss, and tissue recovery is proceeding at an insulting rate. Elas raised his good hand. "I feel like I'm being graded." "You are. Vaughn said your species is medically offensive." She projected the puncture pattern beside a human arm schematic. "Humans appear fragile externally," she said. "This encourages poor assumptions. Internally, they combine dense mineralized bone, rapid clotting, aggressive immune response, and unusual tolerance for pain. In plain terms, Ambassador work survived because humans are harder to break than they look." Menvar shifted back to the real issue. Biology aside, why comfort the juvenile instead of isolating him? Ellis did not hesitate because he was scared, guilty, and expecting the world to end. Punishment would have taught him that fear leads to pain. Mercy taught him that fear can lead to understanding if you stop it in time. A security marshal clicked in disbelief. You cannot apply juvenile correction methods to a Category 5 predator, Elas glanced over. We do that on Earth all the time, not with Verax, obviously, but with things that bite, claw, trample, or poison. You teach boundaries, you reward calm. You do not answer every mistake with exile. Valen realized that was the real reason for the hearing. It was not only about the bite, it was about the possibility that humans had an entire philosophy built around befriending danger. The council pressed him for examples, and the more Elas explained, the less the room resembled reason. He spoke about wolves becoming dogs, about rescue animals raised around children, about humans choosing training over revenge when frightened animals reacted badly. You make companions out of predators, Counselor Thress said faintly. Elas shrugged carefully to avoid his arm. Sometimes, more often, we build trust with things that have every reason not to trust us and prove we're worth the effort. Menvar looked at Keth. And you believe this juvenile can learn? I know he can, Elas said. He already has. All eyes turned to the cub. Keith swallowed hard, then sat a little straighter. I asked before moving near the human this morning, he said. I used words when startled during meal service. I have not shown teeth at anyone in 2 days. Jess behind him looked like he might dissolve with relief. Then Keth drew a breath and looked toward the days. I would like to apologize to the station, not only to the human. Menvar hesitated, then said, Proceed. Keith lowered himself in proper Varick submission, head bowed and claws hidden. I acted on fear. I caused blood and alarm. I do not ask that this be forgotten, only that I be allowed to become better than the moment I caused. Silence followed, then acknowledgement signs from species who almost never agreed on anything. Valen felt something shift in the room. Not forgiveness exactly, permission. After the session, Valen found Ellis in the outer gallery watching Keth chase a training sphere under Jess's supervision. You knew this would happen? Valen asked. Elias smiled, tired, but genuine. No, I just knew punishment wouldn't fix the important part. Valen drifted beside him and watched the midnight-scaled cub stop, collect himself, and return the sphere instead of pouncing on it again. The council will rewrite 300 pages of protocol because of you, he said. Ellis folded his good arm over the rail. Then maybe they needed rewriting. Valen looked out at Keth, at the human who had chosen kindness when everyone expected retaliation, and understood with a mixture of dread and admiration that the station had crossed a line it would never uncross. The bite had not started a war. It had introduced the council to the much stranger human idea that danger, if met with patience instead of panic, might grow into trust. The council did what councils always did when confronted with something that did not fit inside their categories. It formed a committee, wrote temporary restrictions, and pretended that was the same thing as understanding. For the next 10 days, Keth remained on monitored movement status, which meant he was technically free to accompany Handler Jess through the public sections of Concord Spindle, but only if he wore a bright blue restraint harness and stayed at least 2 body lengths from any official delegation. Ilya's Rourke objected to the wording immediately. He's not hazardous cargo, he said, when Administrator Vale and Sword delivered the printed order to the Garden Dome. He's a kid under correction. Valen floated lower, careful to keep one eye on Keith, who was stretched in the filtered sunlight, pretending not to listen and failing badly. The council prefers categories that can be filed, Valen replied. Children are difficult to standardize. Elas glanced at the cub and smiled. Tell me about it. Over the following days, Valen found himself witnessing something he had never expected to record in an official station log. Elas began teaching Keth the way human adults apparently taught their young. Not through fear, not through dominance, but through repetition, patience, and embarrassing amounts of praise. Ask first, Elas would say, whenever Keith crowded too close. Mouths closed near people. Claws in when excited. Use words before instincts. It should have been ridiculous, and perhaps it was, but it worked. Keth learned quickly because he wanted to. That was the part that unsettled Valen most. The cub did not obey Elas because he feared him. He obeyed because he cared what Elas thought. A creature the council had classified as a Category 5 hazard now sat in the station garden while a human ambassador rolled a magnetic sphere across the polished stones and said things like good restraint and see much better than biting. Once when managed to stop a playful pounce half a body length before impact, and instead sat down hard on his hind limbs with every claw tucked in. Elas clapped softly and said, "That's it, that's self-control." Keith's scales flushed such a pleased blue that even Jess had to turn away to hide what was unmistakably pride. It spread too. At first, the staff gave the garden dome a wide berth when Elas and Keith were there, but curiosity has always been stronger than policy. The maintenance crews started pausing to watch, then junior clerks, then a pair of council aides who insisted they were just using the west walkway and somehow spent 20 straight minutes there. What they saw was not a predator being civilized. It was a child being given room to improve. Valen saw it in smaller moments, too. When Keth accidentally knocked over a service cart and froze in horror at the crash, Elas did not shout. He only said, "Okay, what's the fix?" And Keth, after a long, unhappy pause, righted every container himself. When a nervous courier flinched at Keth's approach, the cub stopped, backed away on his own, and said in careful standard, "I can give more space if you want." The courier nearly fainted, but she thanked him, and Keth wore that thank you for the rest of the day like a medal. The station's real turning point came on a market rotation, and like most important things on Concord Spindle, it began with a malfunction. The central promenade was packed, voices rising in a dozen languages, stalls lit in gentle bands of amber and green. Elas had made the apparently unwise decision to buy Keth a sweet-fried coil from a human food vendor, and the cub was trying very hard to pretend he did not love it, while sugar glaze stuck to his fangs. Valen was 3 stalls away reviewing transit permits when the overhead service rail gave a sharp metallic crack. He looked up in time to see a cargo trolley jump its guideline. The loaded trolley swung sideways above the promenade, one grab anchor failing, then another. Beneath it, directly in the danger zone, stood a small Bellari child, too young to recognize the warning alarms and too frightened by the sudden noise to move. The crowd recoiled in every direction except the one that mattered. By the time Valen's limbs began to react, Keth was already moving. The cub launched across the promenade in a blur of midnight scales and disciplined force. He did not leap at random. He did not strike wildly. He hooked 2 claws into the deck plating, planted all his weight, and hit the Bellari child broadside with his armored shoulder hard enough to send them both rolling clear, just as the cargo trolley crashed down where the child had been. Glass containers shattered. Spice dust filled the air in red clouds. Somebody screamed. Security drones dropped from the ceiling on automatic threat response, their targeting lights snapping toward the largest moving predator in the area. Kay froze instantly, not from fear of the drones, Valen realized, but because the Bellari child was now clinging to his neck and sobbing. "Stand down!" Elas shouted, stepping between the drones and the cub before station security could make the worst possible decision. He just saved a life. The promenade had gone silent except for the child's crying. Keth slowly lowered himself to the floor so the child would not fall, scales flashing with panic and confusion. "I moved too fast," he said. "I'm sorry. I was trying to be careful. I smelled fear and metal and falling. And you did good," Aaliyah said firmly, kneeling beside him. "You did exactly right." The Bellari parent reached them a heartbeat later, seized the child, checked them frantically, then stared at Keth, as if trying to reconcile the blue harness predator with the fact that their offspring was alive because of him. The child, still shaking, reached one tiny hand back toward the cub and whispered, "Thank you, Big Bitey." Keith blinked. Then, in the softest voice had ever heard from him, he said, "You are welcome." That was the moment the promenade changed. Not the rescue, not the alarms, the thank you. The parent gave it next more formally and with tears still on their face, then the vendor, then the nearest stall holder who had once filed a complaint titled "Dangerous Reptile" near Commerce Lanes and now looked faintly ashamed of it. By the end of the hour, every witness account said the same thing in different words. The Veraric cub had seen danger, controlled his instincts, and chosen protection. Later that evening, as Valen filed the incident review, he found himself deleting the phrase Category 5 hazard from Keth's profile for the first time and replacing it with something no protocol template had space for. Juvenile under instruction demonstrated capacity for restraint, empathy, and civic response. He stared at the words for a long time before finalizing them. Across the garden dome, where the station lights dimmed into false dusk, Elas sat on a bench with his still healing arm resting over Keth's broad neck, while the cub dozed at his feet, and Valen understood that the human had done more than prevent a diplomatic disaster. He had changed the shape of what the station believed was possible. The market accident should have settled the debate around KE once and for all, but institutions do not surrender their fear just because reality embarrasses them in public. Instead, Conquered Spindle did what it always did when something complicated happened in front of too many witnesses. It called another review. This time, the chamber was fuller, the air tighter, and the mood less curious than divided. Some delegates wanted the Verarak Cub's restrictions lifted immediately. Others argued that one heroic act did not erase biological danger. Administrator Valinor floated near the witness tier with a stack of revised reports and the uncomfortable awareness that he now cared how this ended. Elias Rourke sat at the center table in station formal wear, with his bandaged arm finally gone bare again, except for a faint line of healing marks. Keith was beside him as always, though now the cub wore no restraint harness, only a simple diplomatic collar marked with juvenile status and a temporary conduct seal. Handler Jess stood behind them in full protocol gray, looking as if he expected to either receive a commendation or be blamed for the collapse of civilization. Counselor Menvar opened the session with the kind of dry stiffness that meant he personally wished to be somewhere else. This chamber recognizes that juvenile KE acted with restraint and civic intent during the promenade incident. The question before us is whether that action reflects unusual circumstances or a fundamental shift in behavioral reliability. With respect, Elilas said that's a very elegant way of asking whether kindness works. Several delegates bristled. Menvar did not. He only said, "Ambassador, this chamber prefers evidence to philosophy." Elas nodded once, then used both. Evidence says Keth was startled, bit me, felt remorse, received correction without violence, and has improved every day since. Evidence says he rescued a civilian child when others froze. Evidence says he asks permission now, uses words before instincts, and has not shown a single aggressive response in 11 days, despite repeated stress exposure. If that isn't a pattern, I don't know what is. A reptilian trade-in voice shifted on his platform. "You speak as if this is a training case, not a hazard assessment." "On Earth," Elas replied, "those are often the same thing." That drew the room's attention like a switch had been thrown. Valen knew what was coming, and against all reason found himself leaning forward. Ellis rose when Menvar granted him the floor. He did not speak like a diplomat trying to win a vote. He spoke like a man explaining something obvious to people who had spent too long making it abstract. "Most species in this chamber," he said, "treat danger like a category, box it, label it, contain it, and hope that solves the problem. Humans had to learn something messier because Earth never gave us the luxury of simple categories. Plenty of the things that could hurt us were also intelligent, social, and capable of learning. Some of them became companions. Some became working partners. Some stayed wild and dangerous, but still earned our respect. The point is, we stopped asking only, 'Can this thing harm us?' and started asking, 'What does it become if treated with patience, boundaries, and trust?'" A council archivist raised a lower limb. "Your species applies this philosophy to predators specifically," Ellis almost laughed. "Predators prey animals, birds, reptiles, half the ocean, and in one alarming case, my uncle tried it with a badger." Keith at his side looked up. "What is a badger?" "A small earth creature powered entirely by spite," Elas said. That got an involuntary snort from Valen and at least one muffled laugh from the upper seats. The chamber relaxed just enough for truth to slip in. Elas continued, "You all keep asking why I forgave Keith. I forgave him because he understood harm the instant he caused it. He didn't bite me and then posture. He panicked. He regretted it. He apologized. You don't throw away a child for making fear-shaped mistakes. You teach them what to do next." Keth swallowed hard, scales darkening with emotion. "I am trying," he said quietly. Menvar turned to him. "What have you learned, juvenile?" Keith drew a slow breath. "That fear is not permission. That mouth stay closed near friends. That if I feel too much all at once I speak before I move. that if I cause harm, I fix what I can and apologize for what I cannot. The chamber went silent, not with shock this time, but with the discomfort of having heard something wiser than many adults there had managed all cycle. Then the small berry child from the market was escorted in with their parent, and whatever resistance remained began to crack. The child walked straight up to Keth, hugged his fereg without hesitation, and announced to the entire council, "He is nice, and also fast." No legal argument survived that intact. The vote when it came was not unanimous, but it was decisive. K's Category 5 designation was suspended pending long-term juvenile review. His movement restrictions were replaced with supervised cultural residency. More shocking still, the council approved a pilot interspecies juvenile acclimation program modeled partly on human developmental methods and partly on station safety law. Valen nearly dropped his report slate, reading the final language. "This is administrative madness," he murmured. "This is adaptation," Menvar corrected from the dais, sounding as though the words still tasted strange. After the chamber emptied, Valen found Elas and Keth in the quieter west garden. The cub stretched beside a fountain, while Elas leaned back on a stone bench with the exhausted look of someone who had just argued an entire station into a better future and now wanted tea. "You realize what you've done," Valen said. Elas looked up. "Besides, annoy half your legal staff." Besides that, Valen hovered closer, then lowered himself to bench height, something he almost never did with guests. "You have changed protocol architecture across 17 sectors because you chose mercy in the first 10 seconds after being bitten." Elas considered that seems efficient. Keith rumbled sleepily against the bench. "I like when he does that thing," the cub murmured. "What thing?" Valen asked. Keith opened one eye. "Makes impossible sound." "Normal." Elias smiled without opening his own. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all month." Valen looked at the human, then at the cub pressed comfortably against him and realized with sudden clarity what still remained unsaid. "You are not leaving him behind when your delegation rotates out, are you?" Elas opened his eyes then. "No," he said simply. "If his mother agrees and the council doesn't lose its mind first, I'm filing guardianship papers tomorrow." Valen stared at him. "You were bitten by him less than 2 weeks ago." "Yeah." Elias scratched lightly behind Keth's neck ridges until the cub made that soft, pleased rumble again. "And now he's family-shaped." Valen would spend the rest of his long administrative life trying to explain humans to other species and failing in fresh, interesting ways every time. But in that quiet garden, with the gas giant turning below and the station lights warming into evening gold, he thought he understood one thing at last. Humans did not simply survive danger. They invited it to sit down, taught it better manners, and then loved it until the rest of the galaxy had to rewrite its rules. 6 weeks after the bite, Administrator Vale Ansar stood beneath Doc 4's arch with a transfer slate in one limb and the unpleasant certainty that history was about to become paperwork again. Concord Spindle was preparing for the human delegation's departure, and the station had spent the last 4 days pretending this was a normal diplomatic rotation instead of the event everyone knew it was. Keth stood at Elia's work's side, wearing a fitted travel harness in dark blue with council insignia and a small Earth flag patch. He had grown enough that his shoulders nearly reached Elia's chest, but he held himself with the care Ellis had taught him. Claws tucked, tail low, eyes alert, not wild. Handler Jess knelt in front of him, making final adjustments. "Remember what we practiced," Jess said. "No pouncing during takeoff, no chewing the seat webbing. If you feel overwhelmed, you say so." "I know," Keth replied, trying for dignity. "Words before instincts. Ask before touching. Mouths closed near friends." Elias smiled down at him. "And if that fails, you tell me, and we handle it together." Keith's scales shifted to a deep, pleased blue. "Together," he repeated softly. Valen had signed the guardianship papers himself, 3 days earlier after the final approval arrived from Matriarch Sirac. Her message had been brief. "If the human has taught my son restraint, then he has already done what many adults fail to do. Let the cub go where he is understood." The dock filled with witnesses, because almost nobody wanted to miss the moment when Concord Spindle's most infamous juvenile hazard boarded a human vessel as a legally recognized dependent. Dr. Isles of Vaughn arrived with a medical scanner and her usual offended professionalism. His stress markers are stable, she said to Violin. Better than intake inconveniently. Elias overheard and grinned. You say nice things like insults. That is because I am a doctor, not a poet. Nearby, Counselor Thress was explaining to aides that the juvenile acclimation program now had 12 pending applications from species who had never before agreed to mixed youth exchange anything. Apparently, she said faintly, the humans have made emotional rehabilitation fashionable. Valen lowered his sensory frills in self-defense. The station had changed faster than anyone liked admitting. Hazard classifications now required developmental context. De-escalation manuals quoted human behavioral practice. The old categories had not vanished, but they had cracked, and all because one human diplomat got bitten, chose mercy, and then refused to treat that mercy like something extraordinary. Keith moved to Violin before anyone prompted him. He sat back on his hunches, folded his claws inward, and lowered his head in formal Varick farewell. Administrator Valen Soar, he said carefully. Thank you for not sending me away when I was at my worst. I know I made your work difficult. Valen had prepared several responses, all administrative and all useless. In the end, he lowered himself to eye level and answered honestly. You made my work incomprehensible, he said, but not worse. Keth blinked, then made a shy little cheer up. Elas laughed under his breath. That's basically affection coming from him. Do not translate my feelings into human exaggeration, Valen muttered. Then he extended a lower limb. After the briefest glance at Elas, Keth placed one scaled forepaw against it, gentle as a promise. You will write, Valen said, surprising himself. Elas answered immediately. We'll send updates. Photos, too, Thessalon shuddered. Humans always say that as if it improves matters. Usually it does, Thress replied. The loading call chimed across the dock. Elas led Keth up the ramp slowly, not because the cub was weak, but because the human understood that courage sometimes needed time to settle. Halfway up, Keth stopped and looked back at the station. The officials, the place where he had bitten a stranger and found a future instead of exile. His scales rippled once, uncertainty passing through resolve. Elas, he asked. Yeah, buddy. Do you really think I will like Earth? Elas shifted the travel bag on his shoulder and considered the question with exaggerated seriousness. I think you'll love parts of it and absolutely hate geese. What is a goose again? An aggressive bird with no respect for peace. Keith thought about that. Then I will try words first. Elia's smile deepened. That's my guy. They kept walking. At the top of the ramp, Keth paused once more, then turned and called down to the dock in a clear young voice. I did bite the human, he announced, but then he taught me better things to do with my mouth. Silence hit the bay for one stunned heartbeat, and then laughter broke out across diplomats, clerks, medics, and security alike. Even Vaughn made a noise that might have qualified as humor. Keth's scales flashed bright with pleased embarrassment, and Elias squeezed the side of his neck ridge affectionately as they disappeared into the ship. The hatch sealed. The shuttle rose. Conquered Spindle's order did not collapse when it left. It expanded. Valen watched the vessel slide free of the dock and vanish into the starfield, carrying one human and one cub toward a world that befriended danger on purpose. Then he opened a new file and entered the first line of what he suspected would become another report, Human Cultural Impact Assessment Ongoing.